Okay, so this is going to be broken down into multiple parts. These videos. So I'm going to begin us with the introduction, which is this is the mid 19th century European nationalism. We're going to be focusing on two countries in particular, Italy and Germany, and we're going to start off with Italy because, in timeline purposes, Italy comes first. But before we can get to that, we've got to talk about the Crimean War, which happened from 1854 to 1856, and this is really a pivotal moment in European history. Russia, they claimed that they had protectorship over the Orthodox Christians that were living in the Ottoman Empire. And on the other side of this is the Ottoman Empire, which is like, no, you don't. The British, the French, and then Piedmont, Sardinia, which, if you don't know what that is, this is a kingdom or a set of kingdoms that are in in Italy. So Russia's whole claim is that they are the protectors of the Orthodox Christians. Now, this isn't really, for the Russians, this is a religious view. For these others, it's partially a religious view, but it's more about the balance of power, that Russia is taking too much land, specifically in Eastern Europe or Western Asia, depending on how you want to look at it. All right, so the Charge of the Light Brigade, the Battle of Balaclava. And yes, this is where the name for those hoods that you wear comes from. So half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. So this is a romanticized poem of a really famous battle by Alfred Lord Tennyson. So this is the Crimean War. So this is like today Turkey. Here's Greece, right? So this is the Ottoman Empire. It's a vast empire, but it's old and in decline. The Russian Empire is expanding. They're specifically expanding into this area here called Crimea because this is the Crimean Peninsula. And the Russian Empire wants to take this land because they need access, or they want access, to warm water ports so that they can exert their influence over the Black Sea and then into the Mediterranean. Well, the Ottomans don't like this, and there's really no rationale for this on the side of the Russians. So when you have a war, you need to have what's called a cause bellum, like a reason for war. And so the Russians, their view is that there are Orthodox Christians living in this region, which are living under the Ottomans, and so they want to liberate them. So the Russians are kind of operating on an older style of reasons to do things, like that we talked about, like in the 30 Years' War and things like that. The British and the French and the Piedmont Sardinians, they get involved because they want to counter control of this area, this region, by the Russians. So even though they don't really have anything like religiously, there's no alignment here because you've got Muslims and Christians working against a Christian country. This is more political, okay? So there you go. Now, the battle itself is awful. A lot of people die, and if you look at this information underneath the presentation, you'll see more information besides what I'm going to present to you. But this is where Florence Nightingale comes into play. If you don't know who she is, she's like a nurse. She cared for the sick. I believe it was her and 38 volunteers. They go from Great Britain to the Crimean Peninsula to look after the sick. Conditions were awful. By this point in history, more men are dying in wars from disease and preventable things than from bullets or sword gashes. And the other thing is she's writing home, and the press from Great Britain or from France or from Piedmont, Sardinia or from Russia, they're reporting on this in a way that had never been done before. Okay, so people back in London are reading on a day-to-day basis what's happening. And one of the reasons why is they have cables that they can communicate the information, relay the information from city to city. So it can get back, say, from from Constantinople back to London instantaneously, where before, someone would have to sail that information all the way back, but they don't need to do that anymore. Now, when the Crimean War ends, it's settled at what's called the Treaty of Paris, which was signed in 1856. Even though this was really a conflict between the Russians and the Ottomans, it has far more consequences than just between those two countries. So The Russians and the Ottomans are to keep all their military naval forces off of the Black Sea. It's demilitarized, okay? All the major powers agreed to respect the political integrity of the Ottoman Empire, meaning the West was telling Russia, you can't just keep taking land from the Ottoman Empire, okay? So it says here, like, who benefited and who lost big. So there's a lot of benefits and loss to this. So first is the French and the British, who, like, historically were enemies. They fought against each other, like how many times in the past that we've talked about. They actually worked together cooperatively. And they did this because they want to see the balance of power maintained. They don't want to see Russia get too big or any country get too big. Just as importantly, though, this is the first time since the Napoleonic era, so this is a 40-year span, that Great Britain has actually militarily intervened in Europe. Up until this point, Great Britain has pretty much been isolationist. I mean, they've been, dealing with building their own empire, working on industrialization and things like that. The other thing is the Ottoman Empire was actually brought into what's called the Concert of Europe, and meaning that the great powers got together and they tried to figure out how to keep a balance of power between the European countries so that, future wars like the Napoleonic conquest wouldn't happen again. Russia lost its ability to militarize the Black Sea, and this really threatened Russia's ability to destabilize or diminish the power and influence of the Ottoman Empire in that region. And then Russia was made to hand over the lands that it had gained in the Balkans, Wallachia and Moldavia specifically. Now, these two countries will actually become independent in the not too distant future. So, and then Russia was forced to abandon its claims that it was the protectorate of Christians living in the Ottoman Empire. That was just not seen as justification for Russia to get involved in Ottoman affairs. And the Black Sea was reopened for all international travel, or not travel, but trade. So Great Britain could trade, France, anybody could trade. And it's still like that today, actually, to this day. Now, the public of the nations that were involved, they were not very happy because the death toll of the Crimean War was just unbelievably high. And there wasn't really a whole lot to show for it. Russia lost some things, but like the British didn't really get anything. The French didn't get anything. And the Ottomans, they got lands back that they had lost, but there was no other gain, really. Russia alone lost 500,000 soldiers, so this was quite a defeat for them. Now, as a result of this, though, the Russians are going to become introspective, and they're going to begin to reform things. Like, they're going to get rid of their serfdom. I mean, this is a long time after everybody else has gotten rid of their serfdom, like 70, 80, 90, 100 years after. And they're going to make the slow movement towards modernization. And then a key player, though, in Europe is Austria, and they remain neutral in the Crimean War. And Austria and Russia had actually been allied, if you remember, in the 1848 revolution. So they set this one out, and this is going to change who is involved in keeping the balance of power. And as a result of Austria sort of taking a back seat, you're going to see a rise in another German power, which is Prussia, and they're going to take advantage of this. And then Sardinia, they got involved in all of this because they wanted to have more control over their ability to intervene in the Italian affairs. And also they were working towards creating a united Italy, which is something that Great Britain was very interested in because they wanted a strong Italy to be a counterpoint to a strong France. So lots of things happen here. One thing to understand about the Crimean War is that the old empire, so this is Russia, Great Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria, they were finding it really difficult to actually keep a balance of power in Europe like they had from 1815 till now. And then they were having problems like dealing with internal and external changes because of the times. Okay. All right. Now we're going to talk about Italian unification. So we've got Count Cavour. He's like known as the head of all this. Giuseppe Garibaldi, he's the sword. Giuseppe Mazzini is the heart. And then King Victor Emmanuel II, he's going to be the guy who actually brings all this stuff together, creating a unified Italy. The problem for the Italians is the Pope. Pope Pius IX is possibly a spoiler, but like these are the papal lands. These lands are controlled by the Catholic Church directly, and the Pope himself would be considered to be the king of these lands. Okay, so after Napoleon's defeat and the Congress of Vienna, like reorganizes Europe to be back to the way that it used to be, these lands were given back to the Pope. Like France had actually annexed these, meaning they had made them part of their own country, so they had to give them back. Now, in 1860 and again in 1870, there are going to be movements by various parts of Italy to unite their peninsula into one country. And they are going to be successful in taking this orange area, these papal lands, away from the Pope in the 1860 uprisings. And then 10 years later, they're going to march on Rome, defeat Rome, and they'll annex these lands from the Pope. So if you're Catholic, you know that, and we've talked about this a few times before, the Pope is at the Holy See, which is inside of Rome. And that's actually where the Pope retreated to when the Italian forces breached the walls of Rome, and he retreated to the Papal Palace, and that's actually the residence of the Pope today, to this day, actually. So Garibaldi, at first, what happens is in 1849, we talked about the uprisings, right? Well, Italy is going through these uprisings as well, and they are trying to unify their country. And France and Austria both step in different parts of the country, and they try to put down, and they do put down, these revolts. But Garibaldi defends the city of Rome against the French, and he's successful. And because of this, he becomes like a national hero. He's a big deal. Now, Sardinia Piedmont is the magnet. So this is Piedmont right here, okay? And this is the Kingdom of Sardinia. This is Corsica. This is where Napoleon's from. But these two countries right here are going to have a huge influence over getting all of this land together and forming one united Italy. And it's called Risorgimento, which means resurgence. My Italian's terrible, but there you go. But see how you have the Kingdom of Two Sicilies down here in the south. You have these disparate kingdoms up here, but in the middle are the Papal States. So this means that the peninsula will always be divided unless they can come up with some way to overcome that. So these are the steps that they need to do. There's called the Culinary insurrections, and these occur in 1820, 1821. These are the Coleman. These are the people who rise up and they change the old order, just like we talked about when we talked about France and Germany, Austria. There's always like some spark that starts things. And for the Italians, this starts in the 1820s, and it's the Coleman. Then we have Piedmont, Sardinia. It sends troops to the Crimea, okay? So Piedmont, Sardinia, they do this not for no reason, but they ally themselves with the French and the British. And, where's my thing at? And it's because this guy, Victor Emmanuel, who we talked about, that's him, he has long-term goals of unifying Italy. And he knows that if he can get the backing of the French and the backing of the British, that he can use them to offset against the Austrians, who are not going to want Italy to be united. And he can take over the papal lands from the Pope and unify his country. So Victor Emmanuel has long-term goals, and so he sends Italian troops to Crimea on the side of the British and the French against the Russians. So step 3 is Cavour and Napoleon III. They meet at Palombres in 1858. So Napoleon III, he's the nephew or cousin of Napoleon Bonaparte. He's now the emperor of France. And so he meets with the Italian nationalists, and he supports the policies of this guy Cavour. And what's going on here is that the Italians are courting the French so that when they go to war, not if, but when they go to war with the Austrians, they have the French on their side, because the Italians have no chance of winning if the French and the Austrians are against them. But if they can play the two countries off against each other, then they can succeed. And this guy, Cavour, is able to convince Napoleon III that he should side, like France should side with the Italians, and then they do. So then that means that we need an outbreak of war, and there will be. So there's the Austro-Sardinian War of 1859. So just like I said, what ends up happening is the Kingdom of Sardinia is able to take over all of these lands, okay? So it's nearly everything except for Venetia, which is controlled by the Austrians. But they'll get Lombardy, and I'll explain. Well, they get this from the French, because the French are given this as like concession when they have to sign the treaty, when France signs the treaty with Austria. But the French under Napoleon III and under the earlier agreement with Cavour, they'll give that land to the Italians. So Italy will actually be united, with the exception of this part right here, which is still the papal lands. Let me get to the next one. All right. Then we have the Austro-Prussian War, which is a war that's fought between Austria and Prussia. The Austrians are going to have to move their forces from the south, excuse me, up to the north to deal with the Prussians, because they're getting the war is not going well for the Austrians. And so the Italians are going to move in to Venetia. Okay. At the same time, though, the Italians will also take the opportunity to attack the papal lands and take them as well. So Venetia is the next to Italy. Okay, it's a big deal. How did all this happen? It's because the Prussians were trying to, who are German, are trying to move dominance of the German people from Vienna and Austria up to Berlin, and they are successful. And then 6 is Garibaldi. This is how he gets Rome. So this looks the same, but the 5 and 6 are complementary. Okay, so Garibaldi, remember, he's the guy who defended Rome against defended the city of Rome against the French back in the 1850s. He is now going to lead an army from Sicily up the peninsula and then attack the city and then defeat the forces there, and then turn that over to the king, Emmanuel, and then have a united Italy. Okay, so the Kingdom of Italy is going to be pronounced on March 17th, 1861, and it's by a parliamentary assembly in the what was at the time the capital. The capital is going to be Rome, but at that time it was Turin. All right. So by 1870, all French troops have left, and Rome is now the capital of the new country of Italy. So it's Sardinia, Sicily, and then the peninsula itself. Now, this area right here, which is today part of Italy, is at this time part of Austria, and we'll talk about that when we talk about World War I. That's coming up later. So we have a unified peninsula. So it's a contemporary. This is a contemporary British cartoon, and this is Victor Emmanuel, and here he is, and that's Garibaldi, and he's fitting the king with his boot of Italy. So the Kingdom of Italy, as I said, it's united in 1871, but it has problems. So the first thing is that Italy has 26.8 million people living in it at this time, and about 78% of them are illiterate. Education has not been a very big focal point because, for one thing, it was a bunch of different kingdoms, and the religious system also controlled the education system. So the Catholic Church pretty much just ran things in Italy. Well, now it's gone to secular instead of being religious controlled, and one of the first things they've got to do is increase the literacy rate, because once you do that, then you can increase the suffrage, so that they'll have universal male suffrage within a number of years. The other problem is that while most of Europe at this point is well into several decades into industrialization, 70% of the the adult population of Italy is still based in agrarian style. So they're farmers, sheep herders, cheesemakers, things like that. Not that those are bad things, they're not. But like, if it's 1870 and England is producing like iron ships, that you have a long ways to catch up. Italy is poverty stricken, and it's very widespread, but it's really acute in the rural areas. And then the main focus of the Italian government was first strengthen the military power so that it could stand up to an invasion from, say, France, which it didn't have to worry about because they were allied, but more importantly, Austria. And then just to make Italians, and I really mean that, like, make Italians. Like, people needed to have babies. They needed to get these kids into school. They needed to make people stop thinking about themselves as being Sicilian or Roman and start thinking of them as being Italian. And they do this to great success. The biggest issue, though, after that is land ownership. Land ownership was still mainly in the hands of the old aristocratic elite, and that was going to have to end. One of the things that happened, though, when Italy was united was the lands that had previously been controlled by the church were now available, and then those were divvied out, let's just say. The thing that happens, though, in the 1880s is the price of grain plummets. For one thing, is because places like the United States are producing lots of it, and so is Britain and other places. So, because the price of grain went down, a lot of Italian farmers couldn't stay on the farms, so they emigrated across the Atlantic, and they went to the United States, which I know you know about, but they also went to places like Argentina and Brazil, which also have large Italian populations as well. So that's what happens. That's why. Now, next time we'll be talking about German unification. So that's all I have for this part, okay?